I want to welcome everybody who's joining us today for, this is our first webinar for the year. And today we're presenting Jeffery L. Buller, Götterdämmerung, to end at the beginning. And he's a familiar face to us. I think this is at least maybe, I know it's 4, possibly 5 talks you've given for us. You've been at a symposium and several talks and a webinar for us since we've been under the guidance of COVID. But he's a native of Wisconsin and held academic positions at Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa, Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, Mary Baldwin College in Stanton, I'm corrected on the pronunciation, Virginia, and Florida Atlantic University in Palm Beach County, where he was dean, known to different publics as a classicist, a scholar of Wagnerian music, drama, and an expert in academic administration. Dean Buller has lectured and performed consultancies all over the world. From 2003 to 2005, he served as the English language lecturer at the Bayreuth Festival. And since 2009, he has worked closely with the King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals at the Ministry of Education in Saudi Arabia. Buller currently is working for Atlas Leadership Training, which provides academic leadership training programs that are enjoyable and immediately practical at colleges and universities around the world. So I introduce you to and hand the program over to Jeffery Buller. Oh, and I want to mention, we go back one slide, Emma, if you would. These are a list of the books by Jeffery Buller. The first one was Classically Romantic, which is now in its 2nd edition. A newer one, Eternal Dreamer, The Imagery of Richard Wagner, and then a novel called Die, Meistersinger, and a mystery on an operatic scale. And so with this now, I will hand the program over to Professor Buller. Thank you, Dean Buller.
Thank you, Terry.
And I'll let myself go away here.
And thank everyone for coming to join us today. As she mentioned, I'm speaking to you now from Raleigh, North Carolina, where we've got a cold, drizzly day and a winter storm is coming in. So I hope wherever you are, it's comfortable and warm. And as Terry said, you've got a potion of your choice with you that you've inspected to make sure that there's nothing nefarious inside. We're going to be talking today about Götterdämmerung in a presentation I call To End at the Beginning, because what we want to talk about is the whole notion of what it means for the ring cycle to end, if it ever really does, and how the current ending that we see when we go to performances of Götterdämmerung came about and why it is shaped as it is. Now, what will be very helpful for you to have in front of you during this presentation is a handout with the text of the various endings that Wagner considered for the ring. That was sent to you with your materials when you registered for the conference, for the workshop. If you don't happen to have that with you, or if you've lost it or misplaced that email in any way, don't worry, you can get another one at any time. Just send an email message to Wagner Texts altogether at yahoo.com. That's a Wagner text at yahoo.com. And you'll just get an auto reply. And in that message, you'll find a link to the handout. There's some information about those books that Terry just mentioned at the bottom. You can ignore that if you want. But at the top, the first link will take you to the handout. And you'll probably want to have that in front of you, as I say, because it makes it a little bit easier to talk about the different endings. We can see what the texts were, what the stage directions were, and what Wagner wanted us to be hearing. So we're talking about Götterdämmerung, and it just seems to me to be appropriate that in a presentation where we're going to be talking about how ends sometimes are beginnings and beginnings sometimes are ending, for us to start at the end of the work. And so what I'd like to do, just to get ourselves into the spirit of what we'll be talking about today, is to give ourselves a chance to listen to the last 6 minutes of Götterdämmerung. What I'm going to show you is the 1980 iteration of the Cherot ring, the centennial ring, as it's usually known. And we're going to hear Gwyneth Jones as Brünnhilde. The conductor is Pierre Boulez. And I know that many of you know this work intimately well, but it's useful to have these sounds in your ear as we continue with today's discussion. So here is how the ring ends. there you have one of the most famous and most amazing endings in all of operatic history. Now, I wanted to begin with that ending because it relates to our topic, and plus, just hearing that always just puts me in this contented mood, like all is once again right with the world, which is one of the effects that I think was intended. But I wanted also to begin with that particular version of the ring, the Chirot version, because even though that version is often widely criticized for all the liberties it takes with the staging, there are certain elements of that particular scene that actually are much closer to what Wagner wanted his audience to see than many of the other more traditional versions that we tend to see staged around the world today. For instance, if you'll look at the stage directions, now if you have the handout, this is on page 2 of the handout. Near the end, this is what Wagner wanted the audience to be witnessing at the end of the work. It says, through the bank of clouds that is on the horizon, a red glow breaks forth with increasing brightness. Now, if you've heard me speak before, you know that Wagner was interested in all kinds of imagery, all kinds of symbolism, not only in The Ring, but in his other works, but especially in The Ring. He wanted there to be different symbols that people would see on the stage. And one of those sets of symbols involved colors. He wanted Wotan and the Volsungs to be dressed in blue robes, and everything about Valhalla to be blue, sort of symbolizing the sky and brightness. He wanted the Rhine to be symbolized with the color green. In fact, that's the first thing you see in the stage directions, bottom of the Rhine, a greenish twilight. And he wanted Nibelheim and Albric and all the threats that appear in this work to be symbolized with red. So it's not just accidental that what you're supposed to be seeing here is a red glow. Illumined by this light, the 3 Rhine maidens are seen swimming in circles, merrily playing with the ring on the calmer waters of the Rhine, which is gradually returned to the riverbed. And that's just a laden description. You've got the 3 Rhine maidens swimming about merrily, which is how the cycle begins. So there's an intentional reflection of what we saw at the very beginning of Das Rheingold, swimming in circles, bringing things in their own actions back to full circle, holding up the ring, which itself is a symbol of a circle, as the river, which had left its banks, now returns to its riverbed. So this symbolism of renewal, of things ending where they began, is inherent in what we're intended to be seeing here. Then, from the ruins of the hall, the men and women in the greatest agitation look on the growing firelight in the heavens. Finally, there's a brilliant glow, and the interior of Valhalla can be seen with the gods and heroes sitting assembled, just as Waltrauta had described them in Act 1. A lot of times we tend to think of the end of Götterdämmerung as being the end of the universe, the end of existence. And in fact, Wagner sometimes said that himself. And in one of his letters, he famously said, "Behold my ring poem, it contains the beginning of the world and its end." But that's not actually what we're told in the stage directions for the ending of Götterdämmerung. There's supposed to be all these mortals, all these men and women looking around, watching this all happen, and they remain when the gods are destroyed, when Valhalla is destroyed. And that's what you see in the Chirot version. So that's fairly parallel to what Wagner wanted us to witness. Bright flames appear to engulf the hall of the gods. As the gods become entirely hidden by the flames, the curtain falls. The end. Well, that's the question that I'd like us to consider. The end. Is it an end, or is it merely a comma, a continuation of something that's intended to go on? And what else were we supposed to see in these final moments? So what I want to talk about in this presentation is how do we get there? How do we get to that particular ending? And one of the things that I think a close study of Götterdämmerung tells us is that there are patterns that appear in this particular music drama that appear elsewhere in The Ring and sometimes change what we've seen before. Now, admittedly, Götterdämmerung is not everyone's favorite part of The Ring. George Bernard Shaw famously hated Götterdämmerung. I thought it undid everything that happened in the first 3 dramas. Now, of course, Shaw had his own theory of what was supposed to be taking place, and he had his own ideas about the economic symbolism of the ring, which is there, and he sort of thought that that was all really destroyed by Götterdämmerung. But my point is that, to my way of thinking, Götterdämmerung is sort of like the keystone to the whole cycle. Without this particular drama, we won't understand things in exactly the same way. And that's what I want to pursue today. I also want to pursue how that current ending of the drama that we just saw came about and why it came about in the form that it has. So let's understand that it didn't begin that way. That the work that we now know as Götterdämmerung actually began in an early form as a drama that Wagner called Siegfried's Tod, the death of Siegfried. He wrote it from 1848 to 1849, and saw this as a libretto, a poetic libretto that he was going to turn into an opera. So he, as many artists do, wanted some feedback. And this is what he tells us in his autobiography, Mein Leben. When I read my poem aloud to Edouard Devrient, my sole partner in discussions in theater, he expressed utter amazement. Well, who is this Devrient, and what sort of amazement was he expressing? Well, Edouard Devrient was sort of an all-around man of the theater. He was a singer. He was an actor. He wrote his own librettos, wrote his own plays, directed plays, and also was a theater historian. So he's the sort of person that could take the holistic view of drama that was so important to Wagner and his Gesamtkunstwerk, his total work of art. And when Wagner said he was amazed, he doesn't mean what you might think he meant, because, in Mein Leben, Wagner's not unknown for patting himself on the back, and if any way of interpreting something that happened could be to his own benefit, he would certainly do so, but not this time. Devrient didn't really like it. He wasn't particularly enthusiastic about the work. And here's what Wagner says about that as that passage continues. He thought the play demanded too much of the audience by expecting it to supplement the material of the plot with so much information only hinted at in short epic passages. To put this in modern vernacular, what Devrient was really saying to us, Richard, your play is a little bit too hip for the room. In other words, they're not going to get all these allusions. Your mind is steeped in all the Scandinavian literature and early Germanic literature and Greek tragedy that you're reading, and you've boiled it down nicely, but they're not going to catch all of that when you only get to see it once on stage. You've been living with this for years, but it goes by in moments on stage. And in particular, what Devrient thought people were not going to understand is what Brünnhilde is doing in these final scenes with Siegfried. Their relationship seems confusing. And in fact, if you think about it, even now, it is a little bit confusing how this relationship unfolds in Götterdämmerung. I mean, she hates him enough that she wants him to die and basically engineers his death in the drama. But she loves him enough that she wants to sacrifice herself for him, and then has all these words of that he's the finest hero who ever lived in that final speech. So what his friend was saying is, what's the backstory? We need more detail if we're going to understand everything that goes on in this drama, and in particular, the ending of the drama as you've written it. So Wagner decides he's going to write sort of a prologue for the death of Siegfried, the young Siegfried, a play, an opera that'll be performed before the death of Siegfried. Decides that even that's not quite enough background information, so writes Die Walküre in 1852, and in the same year writes the text for Das Rheingold. One of the patterns that he's got in mind as he's doing this, as his idea materializes, is Greek tragedy. Because Wagner was, above all things in his education, a classicist. Most Germans who went to gymnasium and then to university at the time that he did they read lots of classic works in the original. And Wagner particularly loved tragedy. We tend to think of the Greek tragedies being performed as trill and that's what they're often called. But they're actually tetralogies. They're performed in groups of four. Three tragedies, but then they're followed by a short, lighter work called a satyr play that Aristotle says was intended to kind of lighten the mood. You've got these three very heavy works, and then you needed a little something lighter before you all went home and had your dinner. So the satyr play was kind of to break that spell. Well, Wagner liked that general structure, but didn't want to dispel the mood that his great tragedy was going to create at the end of the death of Siegfried. And so basically took the four-play structure of a Greek tragedy, but moved the satyr play from the end to the beginning. And that's how we have the structure of preliminary, evening, and three major dramas. And publishes this text as a poem, as a prose work, or as a printed work in 1853, and then continues the process of writing the music. Writes the music for Rheingold in 53 and 54, writes the music for Die Valkyrie in 1854 through 1856, starts in on the young Siegfried, which very quickly becomes simply Siegfried, gets through two acts in 1856, he's making great progress, but then hits a brick wall. He's running short on money because obviously this is taking a whole lot of time. He needs resources. He's had all sorts of other ideas come to his mind as he's been writing his prose works about what opera should be and what opera could be. And so it kind of abandons the cycle, prints the poems again 10 years after the first printing in 1863 with some of the textual changes that had come about as he's been working through the score of the opera, and includes in this second printing a famous preface in which he says, "It would be wonderful if some great prince, some great monarch who had the resources to have this work staged could step forward, and this work could be finished and completed and set to music, and it could be shared with the world." Well, that's, of course, the plea that Ludwig II sees that prompts him to become Wagner's patron, supplies him with the resources, and then Siegfried is completed from 1864 to 1871, and then the death of Siegfried becomes revised several more times to become Götterdämmerung in 1871 to 1874. Now, I think a lot of you probably knew that already. And why am I spending so much time on this? It's because it shows us something really interesting in terms of our main point for today. The texts are written in reverse chronological order of how we see them staged. The text that's going to become Götterdämmerung is written first, and each one of the opera's libretti is written backwards from that, whereas the music is written in chronological order forward as we experience it. So we have basically this structure of ends being the beginnings and beginnings being the end right there. And I think if you wanted to come up with some sort of symbol for that pattern as a sound to keep it in mind, some way of recalling this, you might think of this structure of the texts being written and then the music being written in reverse order this way. That, of course, is the ring motive. And I'm making no claim whatsoever that the ring motive actually comes out of this particular pattern that you're seeing on the screen right now. I just find it a convenient way of reminding myself of how the texts were written versus how the music was written, because I think that process itself shapes a lot of what we see in the final product of Götterdämmerung. So if that's true, if that's the case, what are some of the ways in which this blurring of beginnings and ends, of ends becoming beginnings and beginnings becoming ends, how does that materialize in the ring, especially in Götterdämmerung? Well, we can see it obviously from one perspective in the music. This is the opening part of the score that you're seeing right now for Das Rheingold. You see, famously, the work begins with a low E flat played on 8 basses, double basses, 4 of which are tuned so that this E flat can be played on an open string. So you have 4 measures of that. And then a B flat comes in the bassoons in measure number 5, continues for a number of measures, goes on to measure 17, where G is added. And so what we're getting note by note are the 3 elements of the E flat triad, of the basic E flat chord. And so it sort of arises out of nothing into this single note, which then becomes more complex, and then becomes a chord, then becomes melody, and then becomes music. Well, at the end of the drama, we don't have exactly this process in reverse, but we've got something a little bit similar to this. If you look at the score of the last bit of Götterdämmerung, which we just heard, you see you've got all of this very active music gradually being pared down from melody to a chord to a single note, ending with that long held D flat. And so it's sort of like the world ends where it begins, but there's also been a change. It's not exactly the same as what we saw before. So there is change, there's continuity, there's progression, and yet there's this reminiscence of how the work began. Now that's one way I think it's useful to look at the structure of Götterdämmerung and the structure of the ring. Another way that I find really useful for visualizing this work is to think of the ring as being sort of like one of those room divider screens that people sometimes have in their houses, composed of 4 different panels that you can fold in different ways so that you can see different things. I mean, one of the ways in which you can take a 4-panel screen is you can just lay it out flat and lean it against the wall, which causes you to view it in a linear fashion. Well, if each one of those panels represents one of the music dramas in the ring, we can look at the cycle that way, look at it in a linear fashion. And what you notice when you do that is that in Das Rheingold, we've got a world that's wholly divine. It's completely divine, gods and other immortal creatures. When you move to Valkyrie, a lot of those divine figures are still there, but then we have introduced heroic figures. Moving to Siegfried, we've got those heroic figures, and we still have some divine figures, but now the heroic and the more mythological monsters and figures like that tend to take forefront, and the divine figures are a little bit less. And by the time you get to Götterdämmerung, once you get past the prologue, we're basically in almost an entirely mortal world. So the linear pattern is a world of gradually decreasing immortality, of gradually approaching mortality. That's one of the patterns that we see in the ring, if you look at it in this particular way. But to go back to my metaphor of the 4 room divider screens, you can fold those screens up differently, and that would cause you to see something differently. You might, for instance, fold all of the screens flat, so you only looked at one panel at a time. Well, that's kind of what we're doing today. We're looking at one particular drama as an entree to the whole cycle, seeing some patterns in Götterdämmerung that are going to help us understand all the other works of the cycle. And you see it sometimes too when opera companies that can't afford to mount an entire ring cycle because it's very expensive to do will sometimes mount a Valkyrie because that's the most popular work of the ring, and do all their presentations around that. So sometimes this is how people experience the ring. So another way you could fold those panels, though, you could fold the 2 outside panels in. And so you have a double-sided structure where you've got 2 panels, panels 1 and panel 4 on one side, and panels 2 and panel 3 on the other side. And that's an interesting way of looking at the ring, too, because Wagner, who loved patterns and who loved to structure things in line with his ideas and his patterns, actually works that way a little bit. Das Rheingold and Götterdämmerung, which have the beginning and the end, as we saw before, and we were looking at that pattern, are also the 2 4-part works. There are 4 scenes in Das Rheingold. There's the prologue and 3 acts of Götterdämmerung. So there's a nice parallelism there. Whereas Die Walküre and Siegfried are the 2 3-act dramas, and there's some parallelism there. In fact, we can see a little bit more of that parallelism if we fold our screens in yet another way, the way a lot of people have their room divider screens set up so that it's going outward, inward, slanted that way. From the top, I always think this particular design makes a nice W, perhaps for Wagner or via Vaga or something like that. But what you notice when you fold the screens this way is some patterns you might not have seen before. We talked about the expanding from that initial E flat and the contracting into the final D flat from the first work and the last work. But also when you take a look at the two intervening works that occur in the cycle, you see that there are certain patterns that are reflected from one to another when you look at them this way. In particular, I mean the pattern of sleep and awakening. After all, in the Valkyrie, we have three major acts, each of which has as a major moment a particular character falling asleep at a critical time. For instance, the work begins, we've got the overture, Siegmund rushes on stage, comes to Hunding's hut, and immediately falls down and falls asleep. Why is that important? Why is that even worth mentioning? Well, who was Siegmund created to be? He was created to be Wotan's proxy, his second self, his mini-me, you might almost say, to use the modern jargon. And when we first see Wotan in Das Rheingold, what is he doing? He's asleep. So basically, symbolically, like father, like son. And we're seeing this in the first appearance of these two characters. Then in Act 2, when the huge battle scene is going on between Siegmund and Hunding, Sieglinde sees it, but she actually sees it in a dream. So the second act of sleep tells us something else that's important. This is a world in which dreams come true. I mean, when Wotan was sleeping in Das Rheingold, he was dreaming of this palace of Valhalla, and he woke up and there it was. So dreams do come true. And what Sieglinde sees in her image is happening right then. Why is that important? It's important because of what Erda told us in Das Rheingold, these visions she had in a dream. These are not dreams of illusion or delusion. These are real dreams, visionary dreams. There's things that Wotan and we in the audience are supposed to be taking seriously. So when she says she saw in her dream that alles was ist endet, we'd better take that seriously because dreams do come true in this world. And then in Act 3, climactically and heartbreakingly, Wotan kisses away Brünnhilde's immortality, and she immediately falls asleep, associating sleep with death, which is an important theme in The Ring. Wotan, the first time we see him, is asleep. Symbolically, he looks like he's dead. And so here this character who wants to have eternal power and eternal rule, already the very first time we see him, symbolically, he's a dead man. And when his proxy first appears in Die Valkyrie at the beginning of Act 1, his proxy is a dead man too. Sleep is symbolic of death. Well, that pattern is unwound then in Siegfried, where each act centers on a major act of awakening. And those three awakenings are all caused by the central character, the title character. In Act 1, he wakes up in the climactic scene at the end of the act, the sword Nothung. And, we tend to think of Nothung as being reforged or repaired. But if you look at the text very carefully, what Siegfried is saying continually is, I woke Nothung up again. It was asleep, and I awoken him back to existence. So this idea of the sword being woken up, that's a critical moment in the work. In Act 2, he wakes up the sleeping dragon Fafnir for his heroic ordeal. That's going to be the test and proof of him as a hero. It's going to lead to his tasting of the dragon's blood. That's going to give him even more abilities. So that's a climactic scene. And then in Act 3, he awakes Brünnhilde to her new mortal state and also is transformed himself. Up until this point in the drama, Siegfried is really cut off. He's a wild man, a natural boy. He's sort of by himself. He doesn't bond with society. But this becomes his bonding moment. So three major acts of sleep in Die Valkyrie, three major acts of awakening in Siegfried. I mention all of that because once you start noticing things like that, you start noticing how these patterns return in Götterdämmerung and how they give shape to the work and structure to its meaning. So some of these structural patterns that we need to observe are going on in Götterdämmerung are, first of all, recursive patterns, second, dramatic irony, and third, the theme of the double bind. And I want to talk about these just briefly, each individually, to mention why they're important for Götterdämmerung and how they work. Let's talk about recursive patterns first. If we're going to understand what a recursive pattern is, we have to know what a pattern is. A pattern is any recognizable image or figure. For instance, when you look up into the night sky and see 7 stars that kind of, if you connect them together, kind of look like a dipper, that's the Big Dipper. Other societies, earlier societies, saw an image of a bear with this image. Well, we see a dipper. That's a pattern. We're recognizing a pattern, even though technically we're just imagining that it's there. But if you repeat that pattern on a larger or smaller scale, that's what we call a recursive pattern. And so the Little Dipper and the Big Dipper, they're recursive patterns of one another. Probably the most famous example of a recursive pattern is this thing called a Sierpinski triangle. You take a triangle, cut out from the middle an inverted triangle, and you get this, which is basically 3 smaller versions of the first thing that you had. But you can keep doing that. You can do the same process to those 3 triangles you just did, and you get that. And you can keep going infinitely far, where each one resembles what came before it, but each one is slightly different. The pattern keeps continuing with no end in sight. Well, that's sort of recursive patterns, things occurring on one scale and then being repeated on another to remind us of what happened before. That happens a lot in Götterdämmerung. For instance, think of the pattern of the cycle as a whole. You've got the short preliminary evening, and then the 3 operas, Valkyrie, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung. What do you have in Götterdämmerung? You've got a short prologue, followed by 3 acts. So we tend to think of a leitmotif as really being a musical thing. It's a musical pattern that reminds us of a character or a scene or an idea that occurred earlier. But for Wagner, this leitmotivic method of construction, of reminding his audiences of things went before, went way beyond music. He used words to remind people of what happened before. He used sounds of words, and he used the very structure of his dramas so that in Götterdämmerung, your mind would be cast back to what you've been seeing on each night of the cycle so far. This was intended to be a climactic work that pulled together all of these patterns that we saw before. Other examples. In Das Rheingold, we begin with 3 divine women who are charged with guarding a magical object and who fail miserably. It's, of course, the Rhine Maidens and the Rheingold. And then later on, near the end of the drama, we have 2 brothers who quarrel, and that results in the death of one of them, the 2 giants, Fasolt and Fafner. Well, in Götterdämmerung, we have a recursive pattern. It begins with 3 divine women who are charged with guarding a magic object and who fail. That's the rope of fate and the Norns. And then later on, near the end of the drama, we have 2 brothers who quarrel, and that results in the death of one of them, the quarrel between Gunther and Hagen. So if we approach Götterdämmerung not just as a work that forms the end of a line of the cycle, but one that's constantly casting our minds back and reflecting earlier images and earlier symbols and earlier ideas, we see how this work can change the way in which we perceive everything that we may have seen before. Now, another way in which this works is with the technique of dramatic irony. Dramatic irony occurs when the people in the audience are aware of something that the people on stage or the characters in the drama aren't. And there are lots of examples of this in the Ring. My favorite example involves the curse motive. Just to remind you what the curse motive is, we hear it in Das Rheingold when Albrecht curses the gold and the ring in particular. And here's what that sounds like. Well, in Götterdämmerung, Hagen greets Siegfried when he arrives with words that are just filled with hearty, hail fellow, well met kind of words. Hail Siegfried, dear hero. And that's surface meaning is how the characters in the drama take it. The audience might hear something a little bit different because of the melody in which that greeting is given. Here's what the audience hears when Hagen greets Siegfried. So it's not always the case that a leitmotif in the music will appear to underscore what we're seeing. Sometimes it turns what we're seeing on its head or causes the audience to realize something that the characters don't realize on stage. And Götterdämmerung, that's particularly important because in a world where beginnings are sometimes endings and endings are sometimes beginnings, you can't always trust what you see. Appearance and reality are not always the same thing. And we see this occurring on the level of some of the symbols and images that Wagner uses. Another pattern that he incorporates into the work is this thing called the double bind, which basically means you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. You're between hell and high water, or a rock and a hard place, still in Charybdis. No matter which choice you make, you're wrong. And this was a theme that was particularly favored by the Greek playwright Aeschylus. Wagner loved Greek tragedy, but he loved Aeschylus most of all, because Aeschylus, almost uniquely among all the tragedians we know about, wrote his dramas in connected cycles. When Sophocles or Euripides would do their tetralogies, they would do three tragedies that might have completely different characters, occur at different mythic times, that didn't necessarily have anything to do with one another. They were basically episodic. But Aeschylus liked to take a single story and have it play out over the course of several dramas. So you could really see these patterns that affect human life and how mortals are affected by patterns in the universe really play out in the long term. And one of his favorite patterns was this idea that we're all caught in a double bind. It's not that our free will can get us out of any fix that we're in. Sometimes we're doomed no matter what we try to do. So for instance, the Oresteia. Orestes has to avenge his father. Otherwise, he's going to be eternally accursed if he leaves his father unavenged. But to do that, he has to kill his mother because his mother is the person who killed his father. And to kill his mother, he's going to be eternally accursed. So no matter which he chooses, he is doomed either way. Again, in the Seven Against Thebes, Eteocles has to make an unhappy choice. He either has to leave one of the seven gates of Thebes unguarded, which will allow the enemy to come in and the city is going to be destroyed, or he has to guard that gate himself, which means he has to go to war against his own brother and potentially kill him, which means he's going to be accursed and the city is going to fall anyway. So basically, no matter what he chooses, he's wrong. And in the suppliants, King Pelasgus is approached by a group of suppliants, the characters after whom the play is titled, and he can reject them, in which case they're going to curse him and he'll lose his city, or he can take him in and his city is going to be leveled by the people who are pursuing those suppliants. He's going to lose his city either way. Just how do you want to lose? Well, Wagner was fascinated by that pattern. And we see it, for example, in I think a very interesting way in Act 2 of Götterdämmerung, when Siegfried's more or less put on trial almost, where he's being asked whether he had relations with Brünnhilde when he went to retrieve her from Gunther, and he says, on the night I won Brünnhilde for Gunther, no tongue was placed between me and her. I didn't claim the right of husband, which is true. I mean, that's exactly the truth as he sees it. Brünnhilde, on the other hand, says, well, on the night that Siegfried won me, no tongue was in its scabbard, and the two of us had relations. And sometimes critics who should know better will say things like, why is Brünnhilde lying here? Well, she's not lying. They're actually talking about two different things. They're talking about two different nights. Siegfried says, this happened when I was pretending to be Gunther. And Brünnhilde says, this is the night that Siegfried won me. An incident that happens somewhere between the end of Siegfried and the beginning of Götterdämmerung. They're both telling the truth as they know it and are caught in this bind because that's how the universe works. If you know this meme of the two people standing on either side of this figure on the ground, and one sees a 6 and one sees a 9, that's basically what goes on here. And that's what life in this universe sometimes feels like, that you can't get out of the way you see things and the way in which you're bound by your own interpretation of reality. I want to talk about how those elements go together. Before I do that, very briefly, I want to talk about 4 other key images in Götterdämmerung that I don't think get enough attention in a lot of the literature about this particular drama. One is significant glances, or what I sometimes call glimmers, glances, and glares. The second is the one that Terry mentioned briefly before we began, potions that sometimes turn out to be poisons. The third is dreams, and the fourth is false dawns. There's a lot of glancing going on in the Wagner corpus. Blick, the German word for a glance or a gaze, is not a particularly uncommon word. I mean, it's actually fairly common, but it's particularly common in Wagner. It seems to be one of his favorite words. It's a high frequency word. If you look at the number of times it shows up in his different work, it's just all over the place, including 177 times in the Ring. There's a lot of glancing, a lot of gazing that's going on. You have it appear 25 times in Rheingold, 60 times in Valkyrie, 45 times in Siegfried, and 47 times in Götterdämmerung. What's the significance of all of these glances, of all of these gazes? Well, I want to go back to what I was saying before about how little details can sometimes clue you to patterns that you don't notice until you get to Götterdämmerung. For instance, in Das Rheingold, we have a significant glance when they're stacking up the gold in front of Freya, because the giants have finally agreed that they'll take the gold. It can be stacked up and can hide this image of Freya that they just can't bear to leave behind. And Fasolt finally says, I see her eye looking through this one little gap in the gold. I can't agree to this because her eye, it's gazing at me and I cannot endure that gaze. Well, we might remember that later on in Valkyrie, when Siegmund is given the offer by Brünnhilde to enter Valhalla and to live with the other heroes. But he finds out that Sieglinde won't be there, and he turns down the offer. And Brünnhilde, in amazement, says, "You've seen the searing glance of the Valkyrie." And yet he endures it. At the end of Siegfried, when Siegfried and the now mortal Brünnhilde are falling in love, and they're singing about staring happily into what's probably their doom, they say, "Our gleaming gaze scorches one another," another significant gaze. And now in Götterdämmerung, after he's had the potion, Siegfried says to Gutrune, "You seared my gaze with the flash of your glance." And so he falls hopelessly in love with her. Well, going back to my image of the 4 screens, if you look at those glances in a linear fashion, what you've had in 4 works are 4 significant glances, first by Freya, then by the immortal Brünnhilde, then by the mortal Brünnhilde, and then by Gutrune. Or, in other words, by goddess, by divine maid, by formerly divine maid, and by mortal woman. That one image is a recursive pattern of that same image we were talking about before, of this work gradually going more and more towards a world of mortality, from the world of the divine, from a world of immortality. Or if you fold the screen slightly differently, one of the things you might notice is that the first glance and the last glance are irresistible. Fasolt can't give up Freya because he can still see her eye, and Siegfried falls hopelessly in love with Gutrune because of her glance. Whereas Siegmund could endure tolerably well the searing gaze of the Valkyrie, and Siegfried and Brünnhilde were delighting in one another's gazes. Those were eminently endurable. Well, what does that tell us about the character of Brünnhilde, that her gazes are different? And what does that tell us about the two main characters of Siegmund and Siegfried, that they respond to them in different ways? The 19th century fell in love in romantic literature and drama with this notion of magic potions. In fact, the lozenge plot, the thing that causes the great quarrel between Gilbert and Sullivan, is basically a magic potion plot. And Wagner is in many ways a man of his time. And so you notice that in work after work that he creates, we have potions that sometimes have magical effects, sometimes have deleterious effects, and sometimes we just don't know right away. Tristan and Isolde, the whole plot hinges on the drinking of a love potion that they thought was going to be a death potion. In Parsifal, work that we wouldn't necessarily think was going to be filled with magic potions, if you look at the descriptions of the sacraments as they're given, they talk a lot about drinking this vessel, drinking this potion. That becomes an important theme in that work as well. In Valkyrie, when Siegmund is found by Sieglinde, the very first things he asks for is ein Quell, a drink, some refreshment. And that revives him versus the Nachttrunk, the night drink that Sieglinde later gives Hunding, that puts him to sleep and knocks him out and allows the two lovers to have time to themselves. In Siegfried, Mima is always trying to get Siegfried to drink this wonderful soup he's made, which we find out later is poisoned. That's the deleterious effect of the potion. Versus the blood of the dragon that we might expect would be harmful, that actually gives Siegfried new powers. And in Götterdämmerung, we have two potions, both administered by Hagen in his drinking horn. One, a potion of forgetfulness, and then later a potion of recollection that can turn things about and make you see things in different ways and forget what you once knew and remember what you once forgot. Then there's the dream imagery. As I mentioned before, when we first see Wotan in Das Rheingold, he's dreaming, and that dream comes true. When the Valkyrie takes place and Sieglinde is seeing the battle between Siegmund and Hunding, it's happening in a dream. That dream comes true. In Siegfried, Irda has more prophetic dreams. There's an important dream scene in Götterdämmerung too. Happens in Act 2, and I want to take a look at it now. This is a semi-stage concert version that took place in Leeds in 2016. We're going to see Mats Algrim and Joe Polheim as Hagen and Albrecht. And here is the dream scene that occurs in Götterdämmerung.
Schläfst du, Hagen, mein Sohn? Du schläfst und hörst mich nicht, den Roh und Schlaf erringt. Ich höre dich, Stimme was hast du meinem Schlaf zu sagen? Der Mag sei der Macht, der du gebietest, bist du so mutig, wie die Mutter dich mir gebar. Gab mir die Mutter Not, nicht freien Leid belasteten, liebst du so, wie du sollst. Bist du kräftig, kühn und klug, die wir bekämpfen mit mächtigem Krieg. Schon gibt ihnen Not unser Neid, der einst den Ring mir entriss. Wotan, der wütende Räuber, vom eigenen Geschlechte ward er geschlagen. An den Welsen verlor er Macht und Gewalt, mit der Götter ganz ersiebte, in Angst ersieht er sein Ende. Nicht ihn fürcht ich mehr, fallen muss er mit allen. Schläfst du, Hagen, mein Sohn?
You probably know that scene goes on for quite a bit longer, but it presents us with enough to talk about what's actually happening here. What you've got in this particular passage is a particular type of dream revelation scene that Wagner knew well from reading the Iliad. E.R. Dodds, in his famous book, The Greeks and the Irrational, talks about this particular type of dream revelation. So where you've got a character sleeping and another person walks behind them and stands over their head and tells them something significant, something that they need to know. He says that this type of dream revelation is not, I think, at all common in our own dream experience. But there's considerable evidence that dreams of this sort were familiar in antiquity. In other words, they're one of the elements that appear again and again in classical Greek and Roman literature, the sort of thing that Wagner read from his very, very early youth. But that's not all that's going on here. What we realize in the scene is that Hagen and Albrecht are doublets. Hagen is old, and Albrecht is old, and Hagen is prematurely old. He calls himself that, through alt. They're a pair just as Wotan and Sigmund and later Siegfried are pairs of a proxy working on behalf of an agent behind the scenes. So basically what we have are two parallels, Hagen and Albrecht on one side and Wotan and Sigmund and later Siegfried on the other. That parallelism is referred to several times in the drama, particularly in Siegfried, where the Wanderer speaks of Licht Albrecht and Schwarz Albrecht, light Albrecht and dark Albrecht, basically meaning Wotan and Albrecht. So these two pairs of representing two sides of the same coin, that's an important pattern. But also in this week, you get a lot of light versus darkness imagery and love versus lots of things that love is opposed to throughout the work, right? Hatred, greed, the lust for power, sorrow versus happiness. And that's an important element of what the two figures are talking about. How Wotan is waiting for the inevitable end and almost looking forward to it at this moment. But the other thing that I think is really interesting, the next time you watch this entire passage, is notice how each time a major portion of it ends, Hagen says the same thing that he said at the very beginning of this particular scene. Schläfst du, Hagen, my son? Are you sleeping, Hagen, my son? Basically giving us a little ring composition where we've got the same pattern repeating over and over in a recursive way, but always ending in the same way that it began. One last image, the false dawn. Another important classical image that Wagner borrowed from tragedy. Famous scene at the beginning of the Oresteia, where there's a watchman on the top of Agamemnon's roof complaining about the 10 years he's waited being on watch in the cold every night. And he sees a light and he says, "Is it the dawn?" No, it's not the dawn. It's a false dawn, but it is a torch. It signifies that the Trojan War has ended and peace has come. Except, as we're going to find out in the drama, peace hasn't come at all, because when Agamemnon gets home, that's when the blood really starts to flow. So this notion of a dawn that we think is the start of a new day really being false, and things continuing, especially tragedy continuing. That's something that Wagner absorbs from Aeschylus again. And in Götterdämmerung, the first Norn starts off by saying, "What light is shining there?" Answered by the second Norn, "Is the day dawning so soon?" We've got a very close parallel to that scene at the beginning of the Oresteia. But this time it's Loga's fire around Brünnhilde's rock that they're seeing. It's not really the dawn at all. And then in Act 1, Scene 3, when Siegfried, disguised as Gunther, returns to Brünnhilde, the wall of fire blazes up again, and she says, "Is it dawn?" No, it's a recursive pattern. It's a false dawn. So this is a work in which dawns are not always true beginnings, and twilights are not always true endings. And as English speakers, we have to remember that the word Dämmerung, that we frequently translate as twilight, can also mean the twilight that occurs as dawn. It's a word you can use for both dawn and dusk. So you might never know whether something is beginning and ending. Well, if I were you right now, I'd probably be thinking, I've heard a whole lot of disconnected, disparate imagery about false dawns and sleeping and potions and how does it all fit together? Well, when you're making a recipe, the first section you have is the laying out of all the ingredients. That's what we've been doing so far. We've been laying out all the ingredients. Now I want to bring them together to bake the cake that is going to become the ending of Götterdämmerung, and to allow us, I hope, to see it in a new light, or at least to see it in a different light. Even before Siegfried's Tod, Wagner had written a sketch, as he always did, for his drama, sort of outlined some of the lines he wanted to occur in the drama, but basically how he wanted the plot to unfold. And one of those sketches that he wrote was the Nibelung myth as the outline for a drama. If you've got the handout in front of you, it's on page 3. Once again, remember, if you didn't get the handout or don't have it with you, if you just send an email to wagnertext@yahoo.com, you'll get a reply email and you can download the handout from that. Anyway, in this draft prose sketch, which is too long to read, that's why I wanted to have it on the handout. It's really interesting in that the ring was not supposed to end the way we see it. In Wagner's original concept for the drama, Wotan survives. In fact, he continues to rule. He becomes a just and enlightened monarch, and the universe is restored to a harmonious order. Albrecht, too, survives, and he's forgiven, he's freed, he learns the error of his ways and goes on not to sin again another day. Siegfried becomes sort of a messiah figure. He assumes the guilt of all the gods for all the mistakes that they've made and is allowed to ascend into the heavens, where he sits at the right hand of Wotan and is with his father, the Allfather, as he fully deserves, we're told. And Brünnhilde, too, becomes something of a messiah figure. She purifies the ring with her own suffering, and she ascends into the divine realm and gets the final word in the drama as Wagner originally conceives it. Well, that structure of how Wagner saw his drama playing out fit in with his ideas of the time, because we know that in the same summer that he was writing that sketch, he gave a speech to the Vaterlandsverein, the patriotic club in Saxony, in which he said the following: "We ask the king to be the first and purest republican of all. This prince, the noblest, worthiest king, let him speak out, 'I declare Saxony a free state.' And let the earliest law of this free state, the edict giving it the fairest surety of endurance, be the highest executive power rests in the royal house of Wettin, and descends therein from generation to generation by right of primogeniture." So in other words, he hadn't given up on monarchs at this time. There can well be just enlightened monarchs, and they can rule in a fair fashion and bring peace and harmony to the world. That was his plea. at about the same time that he's writing his initial sketch. And that sketch tends to shape a lot of what went into the death of Siegfried. In fact, the first 12 lines of the ending of that drama are pretty much straight out of the sketch that he'd written. In this version of the drama, Wotan still lives. He still rules. Albrecht still survives. But for dramatic purposes, he thought it would be better to give Albrecht the final word as this sort of repentant sinner seeking redemption. And to change Brünnhilde's role so that Siegfried, Brünnhilde, and Grane appear in the heavens in their new enlightened role as a strange sort of new trinity. So there's sort of Christian symbolism and pagan symbolism all wound together. But the idea is that kings and monarchs, we can have hope in government, because if the right people are in charge and they do the right thing, harmony can be restored. Well, after writing that, in his reading, Wagner began reading some of the works of the philosopher Feuerbach. And Feuerbach was an atheist and a materialist and an anarchist. He didn't think there should be any form of government. He was very critical of religion, saw that a lot of the evils of society came about because of religion and because of monarchs, and thought we should do away with them all, do away with all forms of government, get rid of churches, and then human beings would be able to restore harmony on their own. If we didn't have a dictatorship, we would be able to live in a harmonious relationship with one another. Well, suddenly the ending that Wagner had written for his work didn't quite seem in keeping with that. And he found a lot of Feuerbach's ideas rather compelling. So he writes a new ending that we call the Feuerbach ending. You can find this on page 5 of your handout. Again, it's too long to read, but he writes it in 1852. And now, for the first time, Wotan doesn't survive. He doesn't rule because, if kings and monarchs are the source of all of our suffering, then we're better off without them. Let's just get rid of them. And he returns the final word of the drama to Brünnhilde, who is able to proclaim that love is salvation. There is redemption by love, a interpretation of the end of Götterdämmerung that many critics still have, rightly or wrongly, and we can argue about that. But that's an interpretation that comes into Wagner's conception for the cycle at this time. Sees property as the root of all evil. It's the love of gold and wealth that causes all the suffering, and rules are unnecessary because people left in a state of nature will live happily and honorably. Well, as all too many of us have probably done, once you start reading philosophy, you just keep reading philosophy, and that can get you into no end of trouble. So after reading Feuerbach, then, as Roy Pateman tells us in his book, Chaos and Dancing Star, he begins reading another philosopher, Schopenhauer. And Pateman says, it was only after reading, or as Wagner later claimed, rereading Schopenhauer in 1854, that Wagner came to realize that the evil of the world was incurable unless the will was annihilated by complete self-abnegation. Well, that's a different idea. We don't have redemption through an enlightened monarch, and we don't have redemption by love when we get rid of all the monarchs. What is this idea of annihilation by complete abnegation? Well, what was Schopenhauer talking about, and where did this idea come from that Wagner now began to find equally as compelling as he once found the works of Feuerbach? Well, what we sometimes forget is that Schopenhauer was one of the first Western philosophers to take Eastern philosophy seriously. He studied Buddhism, he studied other Eastern philosophies, and he understood the concept of nirvana in the way that it is first presented in Buddhist writings. Nowadays, in the West, we sort of use nirvana as a synonym for paradise or something wonderful. People say things like, oh, I had a massage yesterday. It was nirvana. Well, that's not the original concept at all. The original concept is nirvana means obliteration, the destruction of all consciousness, rather than being reincarnated to live through your suffering again and again and again. If you can earn it, you have the right to basically face complete annihilation, be freed from this hell that we all live in, and freed from all those double binds that's around us, and go on. Well, Wagner turned to Schopenhauer at a time when he was sort of ripe for these ideas. Because in the time when he was writing Meistersinger and afterwards, he was fascinated with this idea of Wahn, delusion or illusion, which again is an important idea in Schopenhauer and an important idea in Eastern philosophy. And so that's when we start seeing words creep into his vocabulary, like Wahnheim, the home of illusion, or Wahnlos, freed from illusion, where he's going to name his residence in Bayreuth, Haus Wahnfried, the house that's free of delusion. And now that we're moving in this more philosophical element, then the ending needed to be rewritten again. And so the political focus is removed. We don't need enlightened monarchs, but we don't need anarchy either. So the atheistic anarchy, that's also removed. And so he writes a new ending that we call the Schopenhauer ending. You find this on page 5 of your handout as well. All human desires are presented as inherently evil, just to long for something, just to wish for something. That's the cause of suffering, this clinging that causes suffering that you find in Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies. That appears. And we remember that at about this same time, Wagner is actually considering writing an opera about the Buddha and to incorporate those ideas more explicitly. So even this idea that the will to live, it can cause you to create more suffering in the world, that's vain. So he absorbs this idea that life is one endless series of suffering that's maybe punctuated only by brief moments of happiness, that if you're fortunate, maybe you could be liberated entirely from existence and get completely freed of all delusion and all suffering. So he writes a new ending and then reads it to his wife, Cosima, on the 20th of October. I shouldn't say 1981, that would be a little bit recent, 1881. She writes in her diary, Richard reads me an alteration he's made in Brünnhilde's last words. I beg him to leave it as it was, and he agrees, saying that the new version comes too close to literary drama. In other words, he's put all this philosophy, all this philosophizing into drama. It's slowing down what's already a long work. He's making it very, very talky. And she goes on to say, in 1872, he shows me Brünnhilde's last words again, and now he's backsliding a bit and says he wants to use some of that new verse, wants to put in some of these Schopenhauerian concepts. But I beg him to alter Wunschheim, the home of desire, and Wahnheim, the home of delusion, which I find somewhat artificial. And Wagner finally agreed, writing in the margin of his orchestral draft, enough, anything to please Cosel. Well, that's what's leading to the ending of Götterdämmerung as we know it. And so he takes a lot of that stuff out, creates this new ending that we heard at the beginning of the drama, and sends it to another one of his friends, August Ruckel, to read. And Ruckel likes it better than Devrient had liked the death of Siegfried, but he had one question. He says that doesn't think the ending quite works, and writes Wagner back and says, why, seeing that the gold is returned to the Rhine, why is it necessary for the gods to perish? In other words, if you restore the universe by taking the gold back, well, why not just, let them go on and have them learn from their lesson, as Albrecht was supposed to have learned in some of the earlier drafts? Wagner's involved reply suggests that he himself could not logically justify the denouement in words, but hoped that it would all explain itself to the listener through the medium of feeling, through the intervention of the music. And that's the medium with which I think we should ultimately experience the ending of Götterdämmerung. So now we saw the last 6 minutes of it from the Centennial Rhine. I want to take a look at the entire immolation scene. From that version done by the Opera North in Leeds back in 2016. The Brünnhilde is Kelly K. Hogan. And I've chosen this version for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's only semi-staged. So now this allows us to hear it and to envision whatever it is we feel we need to envision, from all of those symbols that we're talking about before, all of those ideas that were coming together and gelling in Wagner's mind, these illusions from classical literature and from Scandinavian literature and German literature and symbols on different levels. You can see what you want in the scene. But it's interesting to me that near the end, you're going to notice that the director puts words on the stage and they kind of reinterpret the ending in their own way, deviating from the stage directions that Wagner gives us himself. So here is the ending of the opera from the beginning of the immolation scene. And then briefly, I'll come back and make a few concluding remarks after we've seen it.
Stücke, Scheite, schickt mit mir
And so the ring ends in a way similar to reminding us of how it began, with the ending being the beginning. And it ends only until we go to see the next iteration of the ring, the next cycle we see, where in a recursive pattern, we'll learn new things and see new levels of interpretation, because there's so much that appears in this work. I mentioned earlier that I felt having all of these ingredients in front of us was sort of like putting them together and baking a cake. I'd like to change that metaphor now a little bit and think of all of these different elements that we've been seeing as sort of like different threads that we can weave together, like the Norns weaving their rope at the beginning of Götterdämmerung. You've got elements that Wagner drew from classical literature, from modern philosophy, from Eastern religions, from his own life and his own experience and his own loves and his own times, and pulls them all together. And sometimes it may seem as though in the language of the ring, it doesn't all fit because there are so many things competing with one another and jiving with one another, all competing for our attention. And yet, when you listen to that splendid final music, there's just something ethereal and perfect about it, where it all comes together in such a beautiful and ineffable way that we couldn't imagine any greater perfection. Well, as Terry mentioned at the beginning, I have some works on Wagner. If you're interested in following these ideas further, Classically Romantic, now on its second edition, is about the classical influence, the influence of classical tragedy and epic on Wagner in different ways and how that shapes the ring. Eternal Dreamer, which came out in December, is based on the lectures I gave at Bayreuth. It's about images in all 10 of the works in Wagner's Bayreuth corpus. And Die Meistersänger is just a fun work. It's sort of a lighthearted murder mystery, if you can imagine such a thing, that actually takes place at a Wagner festival, not Bayreuth for copyright purposes, but if you go to Bayreuth, it might be fun to read when you're there. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your very kind attention today, and I am going to stop my share and turn the program back over to our hosts, who I believe may well have some questions that arose during the presentation that we can talk about. Hey, Terry, there you are.
Hi. Yes, and thank you very much, Jeff. You're always so very interesting and entertaining and alliterative in your talks. I really appreciate it. And I'm thinking of Gazes, Glances, and Glimmers talk that you gave for us one time. The Eyes Have It was that title of the.
That's right.
So we have questions. If you have a question, please kindly put it in the Q&A area and I'll get to you, or I'll try to toggle between Q&A and chat. I wanted to let folks know of our upcoming webinars. We will have a webinar Saturday, February 26th, 11 a.m. It's early because I had an important conflict that day and have to be somewhere else in the afternoon, so we moved it to the morning. Also, that's good for our speaker, Cesar Cagnon, who will be coming to us from Oslo, Norway, where he is presently the choral director, conductor, and coach for Opera and Ballet den Norsk in Oslo. He was a 2021 stipendiat, and he's going to tell us how I spent my summer vacation in Bayreuth. Following that, in March, we have Udo Schmidt-Steingräber, proprietor of the Steingräber and Sons Piano Factory and Salon in Bayreuth. And Udo will share with us the stories about famous composers and musicians who played Steingräber pianos, notably Richard Wagner and also Franz Liszt. And then in April, on the 16th, we will have a live meeting. Yes, live meeting at the JCCSF, and we'll get more information out to you soon on that. It will be Jonathan Kuhner and friends. We don't know who the friends are yet, but they will do another introduction. Hopefully this one's not a COVID false start. Introduction to No Love Allowed, pocket operas, version of Das Liebesverbot, shortened and adapted for English language by the late Donald Pippin. And so we'll give you more information about that. We're hoping that you can all join us for those. And the live and in-person one will be, I'll say this now, for members only. Members only, paid members only. So if you haven't paid your dues, pay your dues. We need that to get along here. You know, these presentations on Zoom aren't free, and we pay the help. And so our expenses keep rolling on, even though we may not be able to meet in person. So thank you very much for those of you who have already renewed. If you haven't renewed yet, we encourage you to do so we can keep this going. Unfortunately, we did lose a Wagner Society this year because they just couldn't sustain during COVID. Wagner Society of Boston and the wonderful Dahlia Geffen had to fold up their Valhalla and close down. So we are sure this won't happen with us, but we need to make everyone aware that, you know, we do need booze to keep going. So we'll take your questions and answers. There was a couple that came up in during it. Let's see. One of them was from Anonymous, our very favorite member of the society. What are your thoughts about the absence of dreams during sleep in the ring, except maybe for Hagen?
Well, I think my response would be that I sort of disagree with that assumption. We do hear of dreams during sleep in the ring. In fact, when Wotan is sleeping at the beginning of Das Rheingold, he's dreaming of Valhalla. He's talking in his sleep. We know that he's dreaming. Erda talks about seeing visions in her dreams. And Sieglinde has that very famous scene where she sees the battle in her dream. So I think there's a combination of dreaming and dreamless sleep, because again, Wagner's twisting together a number of different strands. The notion that dreams can be true visions, that's a very popular notion in 19th century romantic philosophy. Appears in Schopenhauer in several different places that he's pulling that in, but also from his classical literature, this notion that sleep is like a little death, and you know, when you're sleeping you look like you're dead. He wanted to use that as a symbol. So we do have some dreamless sleep images in the ring as well, for that purpose, for his use of sleep as an image of death. So I do believe that there's both, and it's not just Hagen that actually has a dream while he's sleeping.
Okay, I'm going to take the questions that are out in Q&A right now, and then I'll go over and move to chat and pick up those. Brad Wade asks, did the rewritings of the ending precede the writing of young Siegfried, or after the writing of the text for Rheingold?
After. It was when the cycle was in sort of an amorphous but semi-finished form that Wagner was struggling with the best way for this whole now very long work to end. In fact, it's interesting. He struggled quite a bit with how in music the ring should begin, and there's the famous story about the vision of La Spezia when he couldn't figure out exactly how the cycle should begin. And then obviously in these various different endings that we talked about today, he's struggling too with how the work should end. But it's when we're already dealing with the tetralogy, not in that very early form, because the young Siegfried did have the ending that we saw, and that was that. So even if you look at the handouts and you look at the dates that are on there for the different works, you can see that those are all after the young Siegfried.
Okay, great. Okay, then aloha from Hawaii from John Chilcott. Great to have you with us today, John. He's asking, you mentioned that Das Rheingold is the satyr play, but in terms of the lightheartedness in Siegfried, is it satyr play? Thanks for that question.
Yeah, well, you know, we were talking a little bit about structure. You could do an entire lecture on different ways of seeing the structure of the ring. One is, you know, to see Rheingold as sort of the satyr play at the beginning. But in response to your question, we've got this fairly light tone for Siegfried. Where's that coming from? Well, I think that comes from symphonic structure, where in a symphony you have four movements. The third act is often the third movement scherzo. It's a little bit lighter work. He's also borrowing from that structure. So it's yet another thread to wind into this very complex structure. So I don't think of Siegfried as really being a satyr play in itself. I think the tone there comes from other sources and other structures that Wagner was trying to imitate. Interesting question, though.
Okay, the next one is from Linda Barrett. And you might want to grip your headphones. Your head might swell here. Incredibly brilliant presentation. Thank you so much for making it happen. So,
oh, wow. Well, thank you so very much.
Okay.
Oh, thank you, Linda.
And then Bradford Wade says also, Brad, ditto, please come back. Okay, Deborah Marion, great presentation. Please come back. Good to see you at the forum. How are you? And this comes from Victor.
From Emma to Victor.
From Emma to Victor. I'm sorry, I didn't get that one. Do we have any other questions out here for Jeff?
I saw that Kirk had asked earlier, is there any other work in history, in any art form that approaches the ring in complexity? And, in many ways, I can't think of something that is really that many leveled. I mean, perhaps Dante's Divine Comedy, another very long work that draws from classical tradition and draws from Christian background, pulls together many different elements. But for my money, it is the single most complex, intellectual, romantic, and emotional piece that I know, which is why I never get tired of it. I can get in moods for different works by Puccini or Mozart every now and then, but Wagner is the will that I always want to go back to, because there's always something there that I haven't seen before. And early in my life, I was rather dismissive of non-traditional stagings of the ring. I've sort of softened in my old age, because we know what the ring should look like, but even some of these modern stagings, although they make us grit our teeth at times, do bring new dimensions, and they're sort of doing what Wagner himself was doing, and weaving together different strands and show us different elements of what's occurring in his thought process. So I'll even throw us up to some of those.
Yes, and Anonymous, I don't know who you are, Anonymous, says, what about Ulysses by Joyce?
Oh, yes. Bad oversight on my part. Yes, excellent. In fact, a group of friends of mine and I are going to reread Ulysses starting on St. Patrick's Day right up through Bloomsday this year. So Ulysses definitely should have been on my mind. But yes, there's another work that is tremendously rich and nuanced and has just about everything you can possibly put into a single work of literature. I'm so glad you brought that up. I really should have thought of that.
Yeah, and one of the other things I wanted to say is I wanted to say hello to a brand new member of our society. She joined after attending our spectacular gala in December, Michiko. And thank you, Michiko, for being with us today. We've got many more of these wonderful programs ahead, and I'm really glad that you got to hear Jeffery talk, because he's one of my favorite speakers of all time. I mean, just the best. So thank you for that. I think we have a new one. No, that was Ulysses by Joyce. So I'm not seeing any more questions. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question here? Emma. We'll let Emma ask a question. Emma,
all right. Let Emma ask.
Brilliant engineer. She's behind the scenes. She produces the webinar, and she's just really the best. It's so fun to work with.
Thank you, Terry. It's not a question, but I do in my mind have a work of art which is equal to the ring in complexity and depth, and it is a work of literature. It's the book by Thomas Mann, Joseph and His Brothers.
Ah, yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Also should have thought of that, because in addition to that, the same group that I'm reading Joyce with, we were just doing Mun earlier this year, mostly Magic Mountain, but other works too. And you're right. There's another work that's just bristling with many layers. That's worth a lot of revisiting. Thank you for adding that. That's an excellent observation.
So let's see, is that a new one? No, I've got that one. I'll just go ahead and dismiss that one. And yeah, it looks like we've got all the questions. Well, I don't have any because I'm always just absolutely dazzled by your wonderful talks. And of course, the alliteration part I really like a whole lot. And it's always a joy to have you with us. Thank you so much for participating in the webinar today. We're just delighted to have you as a guest speaker and hope you'll be able to be back with us again. Also, I want to remind all of our participants, we record these webinars, and then our wonderful video editor, Stefan, he'll pull that down and he'll edit it, because we come in early and then we do a decompression at the end. And so those parts are lopped off, but he puts it all together and we put it up on our Vimeo site. I will send that out, the link to the Vimeo, as soon as it's back up again, in a email to all of the members. So thank you very much for everybody who participated, and kudos to Stefan for doing this little job, and also to Emma, who's behind the scenes and just makes everything look as though it's effortless, but I can assure you it isn't. I see something from Bernice. Thank you so very much for an amazing and informative presentation. It was outstanding. And hello, thank you very much from Berkeley. And we had 2 phone-in people. I'm thinking that one of them was William Webster. If that was you, great. I'm so glad you were with us. And who's my other one? I'm not remembering her name right now, but we have a couple people who come in via phone. And we're getting lots of thank yous and kudos coming through on our Q&A and chat. So thank you, everybody who participated today, and come back and see us again next time with Cesar Cañón.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.